Alright, so meditation 4. The plan for today is we'll do a recap, a very, very brief recap of meditation 3, then move on to meditation 4. Meditation 4 is pretty short, so we may not go full time. We'll just see. So, main thing for meditation 3 is we get a causal argument for the necessary existence of God. And our argument goes something like this. I here represents the meditator. I have an innate idea of, let's be very specific, an infinite substance. I, which once again here is the res cogitans, am not infinite. Therefore, innate idea of the infinite substance has to come from something else. Okay, then we throw in a reality principle. Then finally, necessarily, God, which once again should really just be articulated as an infinite substance, exists. So this is more or less, maybe there's some more little steps here if we're being super pedantic about our deductive argumentation. This is more or less is our argument in meditation 3 for the necessary existence of God. Last quick thing to review when it comes to the reality principle is this distinction that the meditator makes. She doesn't make it, this is part of this period of philosophy, but she relies on it, between formal versus objective reality. Remember, we discussed last time, in the early modern period, what it is to have an idea in eidos is necessarily imagistic. So as a result, the imagination is a pictorial mental faculty. It draws up pictures in the mind. Formal reality refers to the mental picture. It is the thing in the agent's mind that she is imagining. That's the thing's formal reality. So if I say I have an idea of a cat, then there's in my mind, so to speak, a mental picture of a cat, and that is the formal reality. By contrast, objective reality is the source in the world of our ideas. So remember, we said that perception precedes, if I spell that right, imagination. Okay, so that is, in order to have an idea of something, one must first have perceived it. There is no idea without perception first. So, in order for me to have the idea of a cat, I must have perceived a cat out in the world. I could go see a stray one, go look at my cat at home, see a picture of a cat, what have you. But I need to have some kind of sensory experience of a cat, a visual sensory experience, in order to have an idea. Note that as a side view, as a corollary view of this, it would appear that in the early modern period, one is committed, with this framework, one is committed to thinking that blind people cannot have ideas because they don't have any visual sensory perceptions. So there's no such thing as the imagination of a blind person in the early modern period. It's not to say there's not a mental life there. There's things going on mentally. It's just they don't strictly have this capacity of imagination because they have no functioning visual capacities. Okay. So this is this distinction that is relied on here in what I articulate as premise 3 in the argument for the necessary existence of God. On to meditation 4. Like I said, relatively brief meditation. So probably won't take all that long to discuss this one. And we'll save the remainder of the time that we have for discussion. So look where we're at the start of meditation 4. We've come quite a bit of a way here. So we have the cogito. That is, we now have the res cogitans. We have a thinking thing. We exist. Congratulations. We exist. We exist solipsistically. That is, I know that I exist. I don't know that you exist. That's solipsism. Only one. So at start of meditation 4, we have a solipsistic existence of individual res cogitanes, if we're going to do the Latin. Res cogitanes, thinking things. We also have, I'm going to say in scare quotes, God. Remember we said the meditator has really overstepped her bounds here? What she should be saying is we have an infinite substance. So again, we're starting to populate this world. Okay? It's not just me out there anymore. I got an infinite substance at least out there now. Just more than we had a couple meditations ago. What meditation 4 is going to be about, Descartes writes that it's about truth and falsity. Most commentators on meditation 4 are going to kind of refer to this as Descartes' theodicy. Theodicy is a genre of literature that is very common in the early modern period. It derives from 2 words. It derives from the Greek word theos, and it derives from the Greek word dike. Theos means God, dike means justice. A theodicy is an account of divine justice. Usually what theodicies are trying to do is explain the existence of evil in the world. Okay. Now, most of the time, so one of the more common theodicies is because a really common one. Wow, his name is just completely escaping me right now. Spinoza. Spinoza gives a very common theodicy. Hobbes has a theodicy. A lot of these early modern thinkers provide us with theodicies. And what they try to do is explain why there's evil in the world if God is all omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, and all good. Most of them are focused about things like dying babies and like earthquakes, so natural evil and moral evil. Descartes' theodicy is different in that he is not focused on natural evil or moral evil. Rather, what he's focused on is this question. Why is there error in the world? Seems like a really weird thing to focus on when you're focusing on evil. But the way Descartes is thinking about this is to say, look, meditation 3, I gave us the necessary existence of God, so we got God. God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, etc., etc., etc. All these Abrahamic adjectives or modes that we ascribe to God. Sounds great. But why do I make mistakes? If God is omniscient and all good, why does he allow me to make mistakes in my judgment? So remember, go back to meditation 1. When we were excluding arithmetic-based propositions, the meditator originally says, well, God would surely never let me be wrong about this, but an evil demon may. And we discussed how that is trying to get around the socio-political forces of the early modern period and trying not to tick off the Pope. But this question still comes back in meditation 4. Look, if God's all good, why do I make epistemic errors? Why do I hold false beliefs? It would seem that if God is all good, then I should not hold false beliefs. So that's our problem here. And as a broad brushstroke, what the meditator is going to articulate is that we need to revamp or we need to modify our conception of error. So, the meditator provides us with 3 different ways in which we can understand error that is compatible with God's goodness. So in this case, error is our stand-in for evil. So in traditional theodicies, like I said, they're trying to explain why babies die, or like why people die in earthquakes and whatnot. Here, Descartes is trying to explain, well, why is there epistemic error? And these two are supposed to be similar ideas: error, epistemic error, and moral evil. The 3 reasons, or the 3 ways in which Descartes tries to make epistemic error compatible with God goes as follows. So the first one, I don't fully understand God, which is to say, I'm a finite substance, God is an infinite substance. Look, some things are just above my pay grade. Simple stuff. I don't get them. Okay, a little weak, but a possible case. So there's some of the things we just don't understand. And second one is that error should be judged globally, not locally. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that when we think of something as an error, we need to look at the scope. Error should not be understood in terms of an individual or a small set, but rather we need to consider the entire cosmos, the entire universe, when we consider error. This is a very common articulation or a very common response in theodicies of this time period. Most of them will say something like this. So when they say, well, like, why do babies die? They'll say, look, this seems evil when we look at it from the scope of the dying baby, but if we look at it from a cosmic scope, maybe this changes somehow. Convincing or not, I leave that up to you, but this is what the meditator is going to argue. And then the one that we're going to focus on, the one that is most interesting, is that error is caused by the will, not by the intellect. This is our one that we're going to be focused on. Error is caused by the will and not by the intellect. So what does that mean? If you recall, when we discussed Cartesian metaphysics in meditation 3, we said that Cartesian metaphysics is trifold. I'll worry about it. Cartesian metaphysics is trifolded. At our most fundamental level, we have substance. On top of that, we have attribute. And then on top of that, we have mode. If we apply this to the res cogitans, we have a finite substance whose primary attribute is thought. And then there are different ways in which thought can be manifested. So we have willing, thinking, affirming, denying, etc. Okay? He doesn't provide us an exhaustive list. Now, so these are simply different ways in which the mind, or the res cogitans, can demonstrate its principal attribute of thought. And what the meditator is going to do here is draw a distinction between two mental faculties, or two mental modes. So on the one hand, we have willing, which is governed by what we're going to call the will. And on the other hand, we have, I'm going to say intellecting. I know that doesn't sound like a real word, and I'm not sure if it is. But that's what we're going to call it, because it's governed by the intellect. Just trying to make gerundives out of these nouns. Now, do not get confused. These faculties of the intellect and the will, they're not substances. They don't exist independently. There's no such thing as the will running around. There's no intellect running around. They're all manifestations or modes, ways in which thought can occur. So both the will and the intellect belong over here in mode. Okay, they're just different ways in which the mind can do its thing. Now, here we're going to get a discussion of freedom. Okay, a discussion of free will. It's kind of latent in there, but that's what's going on. And Descartes is going to interact with two different conceptions of free will. Our first conception of freedom is what I'm going to call freedom of indifference. Our second kind is I'm going to call a freedom of spontaneity. I will also refer to this as leeway freedom versus source freedom. Now, Descartes doesn't admit these. These are not strictly Cartesian conceptions of freedom. They do play other work in the early modern period. But whereas a lot of early modern thinkers are going to try to divorce these two conceptions of freedom and say they are just distinct conceptions of freedom, Descartes is going to try to conjoin them and say that they are one conception of freedom. So, to give a little bit more frame of reference or another example, when it comes to considering how we consider concepts, so here we have this concept that is freedom, and we're saying there's different ways we can understand this concept of freedom. So if we look at it perhaps more graphically, we have freedom, and then we have a leeway account versus a source account. And note that they're distinct. What the meditator is going to try to do is conjoin them. We see similar things with regards to other concepts. So for example, when it comes to the concept of evil, you'll get those that endorse a negation account versus those that endorse a substantive account. So, for example, the negation account says that evil is merely the lack of goodness. By contrast, the substantive account of evil maintains that evil is its own thing, its own force in the world. So consider a substantive account is kind of like how many people conceive of like a devil-like figure or like Disney villains. that they are just their own independent thing that is evil. There is good and there is evil. So if you're familiar with like Eastern philosophy, this is kind of the way the East conceives of it. So if you've seen like the yin yang, this is a very Eastern conception. There is goodness in the world, there is evil in the world. This is also very indigenous, really the whole world, most indigenous cultures view goodness and evil this way as two distinct things. A negation account is simply saying, look, evil's not its own thing, it's just the lack of goodness. Kind of the way we think about light and darkness scientifically. Light is a substance. There's a thing in the world that is light, and perhaps it is physically manifested in the photon. There is no such thing in the world that is darkness. There is no subatomic particle, if you will, that I could point to that is darkness. Darkness is simply the privation of light. It's the lack of light. So we see this is already this methodology, if you will, of understanding a concept in distinct ways has precedence in other parts of philosophy. So freedom versus, when it comes to a leeway versus a source account of freedom, let's work on differentiating these two just a bit more. Looking at my notes here, see. So we may say that a freedom account is, or the leeway account is the freedom to do or refrain from some action. I may even say that it's the power. What a leeway conception of freedom is identifying is that agents have a power to do or refrain from some action. I'm going to put the source conception on the board and then we'll distinguish the two in more detail. The source conception is to have the power to act in a manner that is not determined by an external source. Okay, these sound really similar, right? But there's a distinction between the two. So if we look at this free will debate, we have three positions you can take. You can take the position of free will, unbounded free will. You can take, I'll put it down here, the position of determinism, which is there is no free will. Everything is predetermined. Or you can take this middle ground. I'm going to call it 1.5 instead of, so I got 1, 2, 1.5, because it's a middle ground position. And this middle ground position is called compatibilism. Compatibilism is trying to negotiate, if you will. It's trying to blend free will with determinism and say, look, there's not really a problem here. We can merge these two together in some weird way. So this leeway account is incompatible with determinism. So determinism maintains that whatever action one does, one could not have done differently. That is, one did not have the power to act differently. So for example, I just threw my marker on the desk. Determinists would say, I could not have acted differently. All right, there is no possible world in which I did not throw the marker on the desk. Okay, this is more, obviously that's a very minor and silly example, but this view becomes more meaty when we think about moral problems. So for example, consider people who commit moral atrocities, such as, let's say, murder or genocide or rape or kidnapping, whatever, all kinds of moral atrocities that people commit. The determinist is committed to saying, look, she could not have done otherwise. There is no world in which she could have done otherwise. Whereas the free willist is going to say, yeah, she chose to do these things. Right? And this becomes even meatier when we think about punishment. If one could not have done otherwise, we maybe have to modify the way we view punishment, because it seems odd to punish someone for something they could not have helped doing. But that's a different discussion. So this leeway conception of freedom is saying that one has the power or the capacity to refrain from doing some action. That is, one did not have to behave in the way that one behaved. So these two are incompatible with one another. By contrast, the source conception of freedom is saying that one has the power to act in a manner that is not determined by an external source. So traditionally, this is understood as like God, or now we kind of understand this in terms of the laws of physics and things like that at a subatomic level, if everything is truly physical. What a source conception of freedom is saying is not that one could not have done otherwise. Rather, it's that one can make decisions that are not predetermined by some external force. So under a source conception or a freedom of spontaneity conception of freedom, there's no puppet master. We're not marionettes, okay? On this conception, we're kind of like marionettes, that you move in the way that you were already predetermined to move. Maybe there's no puppet master. This view is not committed to saying there's a puppet master, but nevertheless, your moves were not yours to choose. A source conception is implying that there is a puppet master, whether it be the subatomic laws of physics or God or, I don't know, giants, the flying spaghetti monster, whatever it may be. There is some puppet master out there that is pulling the strings. And the source conception is saying that we are not, we are able to make decisions outside of that influence. So traditionally, these two views of freedom are divorced from one another. But the meditator is going to say, nah, they're compatible. These two conceptions of freedom go together. And the way she does that is to differentiate, like I said, between two modes of thought, which is willing. You will sometimes see this referred to as judging. It's not like Karen-style moral judging. It's making a judgment, a decision. Versus intellecting, to use my made-up verb. We may even just call it, I'm a little bit more hesitant, but I'll run with it, reasoning. And remember, these two are governed by two different modes of thought. Okay? Now, what the meditator is going to conclude, I'm going to have to erase this stuff. Some stuff's got to go. You go. Halfway. Good. So what the meditator is going to conclude here is that the will is unbounded. That is, the will can make any decision it wants. The will is completely free. Okay? By contrast, so this is not a formal argument, don't get confused by my numbering system. Forgive me for that. The intellect is bounded. So the intellect cannot make any the intellect doesn't make decisions, but the intellect cannot reason in any way that it desires. The intellect can only reason in accordance with clear and distinct perceptions. Okay? As well, perhaps, with deductive validity. So, technically speaking, getting into the precision of the word here that the meditator is using, the intellect is infallible. So, put that over here. Intellect is infallible. That is, the intellect can never make a mistake. But look at church, look at the world around you. We make errors with regard to we make epistemic errors all the time. The meditator is saying that the source of our epistemic errors is not in the intellect, but it's in the will. Because the will is fallible. Okay? So this is kind of the process that the meditator has in mind. We have a proposition, call it P. Okay? So A intellects P. A is some agent, P is our proposition. So the agent is intellecting some proposition. The agent intellects that the proposition is true. Okay? Because this is a source of intellection, A is necessarily correct about this. Because like we said, the intellect is infallible. So whatever conclusion the intellect reaches on the veracity of a proposition is always true. By contrast, if A intellects that P is false, she's right about that. She's right regardless of what intellection she reaches, because the intellect is infallible. Cool. But then this gets kicked down the assembly line, so to speak, from the intellect to the will. And A wills or judges, whichever verb floats your boat, P. Same proposition, okay? If I'm rendering a different proposition, I'll use R. So A now has to judge whether or not she believes, whether or not she affirms or denies P. Okay? So she can either choose to affirm, which is to hold a belief, or to deny, which is to not believe. And this is where she could be wrong. All error, according to the meditator, comes from the will. The intellect does its job right every single time. Okay? But when the intellect kicks it down to the will, in order to choose whether or not an agent is going to believe in a proposition, now she can go wrong. Okay? So, think of it this way. The intellect determines the truth of the proposition. The will determines whether or not you are going to believe the proposition. So, under this picture, truth and belief are separate. That is, you can know something and not believe it, as weird as that sounds. Or you can know something is false and still believe it. So for example, I don't know if this is a great example, but the intellect reasons, let's say we have an external world now, we'll get there in meditation 6. The intellect reasons that the earth is vaguely spherical, or mostly spherical, right? The intellect reasons that. The intellect can never be wrong about that. But nevertheless, you're going to have flat earthers, okay? Where the issue of the flat earther is coming in, according to this model, is that the flat earther is then judging or willing to reject the truth, of the proposition the earth is spherical. So you have a proposition, the earth is spherical, the intellect reaches that conclusion, intellect can't be wrong, but then the will says, nah, I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that the earth is spherical, and rejects the proposition. That's where errors in judgment come in. They come in from the will. Now, you may be thinking, well, if God is all good, because remember this is supposed to be a theodicy, we're supposed to be defending divine, why there's error in the world while preserving God's omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence in some way. You may be saying, well, if God's all good, why did he give me a will? That just seems like really cruel to give me this thing that can screw me up. And the meditator is going to conclude the exact opposite. The meditator is going to conclude that this will is part of God's goodness because it allows for us to make decisions. Okay? But she's also going to conclude that even though we have the capacity to mess up, we see God's goodness, God's omnibenevolence, in that we have an intellect, in that we have this mode of thought, to go back to Cartesian metaphysics, we have this mode of thought that is infallible. So the meditator is going to say, look, if we could just wrangle this in, we could be epistemically sound. We could be in a position where we never make an epistemic error, because we have a faculty given by God as a mode of thought that is infallible. But we also have this one, because God is supposed to be omnibenevolent, that leads to our mistakes. And I take it this is what the meditator is trying to do in the project, right? So the meditator, she takes her all the way to meditation 4 to articulate this. But what the meditator is trying to do all the way back into meditation 1 is to say, look, I realize that I have beliefs that I have willed or judged that are not in accordance with what my intellect reasoned. Okay, there's a disparity between what I judge and what I intellect. This is where I've gone wrong. So now what the meditator is trying to do is bring her will in line with her intellect. So if we want to view it visually, you got the will represented by W, you got the intellect visualized by an I here. Imagine it's 2 roads. Okay? The intellect's just going on its way. But then the will bisects it. Okay? It runs into the intellect. And now we get error. The point of the meditations, the goal of the project, is to fix that. Is to make the 2 run parallel to one another. Okay? So that whatever the intellect intellects, the will also affirms. So the intellect reasons that P is true, and then the will affirms P. The intellect reasons that R is false, so the intellect or the will rejects R. Okay, it's a 2-step process. And she notes that some of her beliefs should look like this. The intellect reasoned that R is false, but she believed it anyway. That's the point of the meditations, is to bring the will in line with the intellect. Okay. Looking forward to next week, where it's our last week in the meditations proper, so in the actual text, because in 2 weeks we will be looking at some correspondence between Descartes and some of his contemporaries. We're definitely going to look at the correspondence between Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and Descartes. I love looking at that one because in the early modern period, women just aren't respected. And even in the history of philosophy, women have been just grossly underrepresented. And this is a wonderful time when this woman, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, just slammed dunks Descartes. Utterly just slam dunks him. And Descartes, he fumbles hard. He tries to come up with these just utterly wild ideas to respond to Elizabeth's objection, but it's so clear that Elizabeth wins. And here you have this woman, she's well educated, she has nobility, but just completely slam dunking all over Descartes. So I love reading that, their interaction. And then we'll look at the interaction between either Mersenne or Hobbes. I like the Hobbes one because it devolves very quickly into a series of ad hominems where they just insult each other. And it shows you that ad homineming, that's a word, is not a contemporary phenomenon. Even in the early modern period, these two highly educated, well-respected men, they just devolve into calling each other names throughout their correspondence, and it's pretty fun to read. So I'll decide which ones we're going to read. Probably, definitely Elizabeth, probably Mersenne. But next week we do Meditations 5 and 6. Getting off my tangent. Meditation 5 is yet another proof for the necessary existence of God. And one question we have to ask ourselves is like, well, we did this in Meditation 3 with the causal argument. Why are we doing it again? It seems weird to double prove something that you've already proven. But in Meditation 5, we're going to get what's called an ontological argument for the existence of God. And to understand this one fully, we're going to have to look at Aquinas and some medieval thinkers, because Descartes is very much drawing on this medieval tradition. And then Meditation 6, we put everything back together and we get a complete picture of the world that is built upon this harmony between the will and the intellect. Well, that's next week. All right, I'm going to end us there.